If somebody asked you, what's the most important of all a commandment is a divine law. It's a rule in a sense that we receive from God, so it doesn't have to be Christian, it doesn't have to be Jewish. That's where it was. But they're coming to him because they're Jewish people. Both the Pharisees and the Sadducees made a big deal out of making sure that they were faithful to the teachings of the Jewish law, okay? That's what this is coming about. And they gathered, and they asked the question, what's the greatest commandment? So if you had to answer, if somebody came to you today and says, Christians, there's a lot of rules and regulations in the Old Testament, there's a lot of rules and regulations in being a Catholic and being a Christian, what's the most important of all the rules and regulations? What would you say? Take a guess for yourself. It's a little bit like playing Monopoly. You ever play Monopoly? Yeah, well, sometimes you go directly to jail, you do not pass go, right? Well, that's what I'm looking at here. What's the most important commandment? What did Jesus tell him? You know, what you don't know probably is this happens to be the Jewish morning prayer. The Shema. I don't know much about Jewish people, but I know that this is part of their morning prayer. What does it say? Teacher, which commandment is the greatest? And what does Jesus say? You shall love, this is the commandment, quotation from the book of Exodus. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. And this is the greatest and the first commandment. That's what it's saying. Did you know that? What's he saying? He said there's two commandments. If you keep these two commandments, you keep all the other commandments automatically. So that we know the 10 commandments or the prescripts of the church, okay? He says, and then this is the greatest and the first commandment. And then he says something, be careful here. The second is like it. When he calls it second, what does that mean? It doesn't mean in second place. What he's saying, there is another commandment that's important. And that commandment is the one to love your neighbor as yourself. It's just as important as the first commandment, so it's not in second place. He says the second is like it. If the first one is in the first place, the second one is also in the first place. So loving your neighbor, if you look at that, Jesus, how many times in his parables, in his teaching, Jesus tells us that if we want to be faithful to him, if we want to end up going to heaven in the end, what do we have to do? We have to follow him. Remember when Jesus says, I am the way. What does that mean? What does it mean to be the way? If you want the path, if you want to follow the life of goodness, who do you have to follow? It's Jesus is at the end of it. There is no shortcut. So even people who don't believe in Jesus, if you look at it, they'll still be judged by those same rules. So what is the second? The second tells us how that rule is applied. The rule to love God above all things, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. What does Jesus say? Loving your neighbor is the test of how much we love God. So if we don't love our neighbor, we're fooling ourselves that we love God. That's the notion here. You got to understand that. So what's so the commandments, the sacraments, all those things only have meaning in this context because if we got to put God first and we got to treat our neighbor as yourself. What did Jesus say? He tells us one of the places it's most clear, it's in the Gospel of Luke. Love God of all things. They asked him those questions during his time as well. Love God above all things, love your neighbor as yourself. What did Jesus change that? What did he change it to? This is a test. Yeah, when you knock on the pearly gate and Peter says, what's the commandment? You got to know, you got to have done it. What's he saying? Jesus says, not only love your neighbor as yourself. What did he say? Love your neighbor as I love you. If you know anything about Jesus, what's he telling you? He's the example and he's the model. That's what he's telling us. If you want to know what it means to love your neighbor, you got to look at Jesus. And the way Jesus treated people is what he's asking you. That's the way you treat other people as well. That's the notion, huh? Well, just a piece of trivia. You like trivia? Yeah. If you're a Jewish person, if you know Jewish persons, I don't have the whole text here, is almost invariably, even if they're not practicing Jews, if you go to their house on the side of the doorpost, you'll find a little metal attachment about this long. In Jewish language, it's called a mezuzah. And they won't tell you about it, but if you look at if you go to a Jewish family, look at the door. If they're practicing Jews, it'll be there. What is it? It's this passage in Hebrew. You all know Hebrew, right? Yeah, I know that. Yeah, isn't that interesting? And then if you look in the Bible where this comes from, the first reading, it says, "Teach your children this lesson." You hear that? To love God above all things. When we have baptism, we have sponsors. What's the duty of sponsors? If the parents fail in their duty to bring their kids up as believers in Christ, who does the duty fall to? The sponsors. So it's not an honorary. It's the fallback position to make sure that every child knows this commandment in a sense. So Jewish people use this for their morning prayer. So Orthodox Jews will know that just like that. They'll know the whole thing all by memory all the time. I give it to you. So that's one. Two, the mezuzah's on the door. The mezuzah's this message in Hebrew. So evidently they take it pretty seriously, don't they? Yeah. And here Jesus it's Jesus who's telling the Pharisees and the Sadducees, those people he's calling hypocrites. Why is he calling hypocrites? They talk one way and live another. A hypocrite means somebody who says something but then doesn't do it, okay? That's the notion. So you got to ask yourself, as a good Christian, would Jesus call you a hypocrite? You're here in church, so that's pretty nice, okay? You're on the good side of the Lord, but you know, that's what he's talking about. The message he's got for us is we've got to be serious about our love for God. That's got to be serious. That's got to be at the center of the life. And it's not the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are all negative. Do you notice that? Thou shalt not. What does this one say? You shall. There's no not in it. So when you go to confession, most of us go through a list of the things that we did that were wrong. Well, if we were listening carefully to Jesus, what should we do when we go to confession? These are the ways that I failed to do good things in the world today. Is the world today a little bit better because of something that you did yesterday? If you're going to love God above all things, love your neighbor as yourself. What are you doing for your neighbor in your life? What are you doing that makes life for somebody else in this world better just because you did it? Now, we're not expected to go into confession and says, you know, my neighbor needed a helping hand, but I was too busy and didn't get around to doing that. We emphasize the negative. We don't emphasize the positive. What I'm trying to tell you, if you know this prayer of Jesus, if you know, and he mentions it 4 or 5 times, so it's not that we can miss it. But what he's telling us is the way we show our love for God is how we love other people. So let me sum it up what the word love. Nice word, really. Abused to no end, right? You know, what's love mean? Don't look in the dictionary. The dictionaries aren't big enough to give all the meanings. What does it mean? If you tell somebody you love them, what really are you saying? If you put that in ordinary English to explain that to somebody, what would you say? If I say I love you, what I'm saying, I want what's best for you. You're so important in my life that I want what's best for you, and I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that I help you get what's best in your life. Well, flip it a little bit. If somebody tells you, I love you, in that sense of the Bible, what are they really saying? They're telling you that what do they want for you? They want for you what's absolutely the best that you can possibly have in this world. That's a pretty powerful message, isn't it? And I'm going to suggest that if we understood what that means, I want the best for you, we would be a little careful how often and how we use that word, okay? That's the notion on that. So, well, that's enough, ain't it? Yeah, well, all we have to do is love God. That's it. And if we love God, we'll show it by the way we treat one another. So we'll be judged at the end of time, Catholics and non-Catholics, what we did to make life better, what we did to help other people, what we did that shows that we really want what's best for them.